Hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how the books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So welcome. And please join us every Monday evening at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other, and with you, in an effort to bring us together. If you missed last week's episode with Francine Prose and LaTanya McQueen, or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Birds Books Crowdcast channel and watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. Tonight, Birds Books hosts a reading by and conversation with Susan Shreve and Thomas Becker. I will return at the end after the readings and discussion and bring your questions and comments to the authors. For those of you unfamiliar with Crowdcast, many of you have already discovered the chat to the right of your screen. Feel free to comment at any time. But if you have a question, please go to the bottom of your screen and see the Ask a Question tab, and that's where you will ask a question that I can go and retrieve and ask the authors. Third, there is a Birds Books Write America tab at the bottom. So please go and check out the rest of our season and any book that you might like to get by the authors. Now, a little bit about our first speaker. Susan Shreve is an American novelist, memoirist, and children's book author. She has published 15 novels, most recently More News Tomorrow, and a memoir, Warm Spring Traces of a Childhood. She has also published 30 books for children, most recently The Lovely Shoes, and edited or co-edited 5 anthologies. Shreve co-founded the Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing program at George Mason University in 1980, where she teaches fiction writing. She is the co-founder and the former chairman of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. She lives in Washington, D.C. Please welcome to the screen, Susan Shreve. Let me go retrieve her.
Hello, how are you? Nice to see you. I'm going to begin by reading from my last book, which is called More News Tomorrow. It is a story of essentially, I live in Washington, D.C., and what people thought it was going to be was present news. It is not present news. It is just news of lives. And in this particular book, I was interested in what was a drama that began with a young girl whose mother is killed on a camping trip. They are on their way. Her parents own a boys camp, and they are on their way to the boys camp by canoe and have set up camp on the way. And her mother is murdered, and her father confesses to the murder. And she never actually believes that her father could have done it. She loved him. He spent time in jail and died in jail. And it's not a thing you want to believe. So I have a couple of things to read to you. There is a character who is a major character in the book, whose name is Roosevelt, who is her friend. He is on this camping trip. He was very fond of her when they were on the camping trip, and then this tragedy happened, and she has not heard from him since, nor anyone else. And this is the beginning of the book, and it's in Georgiana's story. The letter from Roosevelt McCrary, that's his name, that upended Georgie's life came the morning of her 70th birthday, written on Camp Minnehaha stationery and dated June 18, 2007. The handwriting sloped, the way Georgie's father's had been, the way children were taught to write script in the 30s. The paper smudged from handling. He must have written Georgie and then reread the letter again and again for months before he decided to mail it. Dear Georgiana, you may not remember me. I was 11 and you were 4, and your mother was 33 and your father was 37 when I last saw you. And now I am 77 and you must be 70 this year. And I wish you a very happy birthday. If you are receiving this letter and have any interest in hearing from me, here I am. I have lived as a groundskeeper and general carpenter at your father's camp since I was 24, 13 years after your mother died. In time, I became a part owner and now live at the camp in retirement, but will keep the grounds and repair the occasional chair or cabin window. There were 9 people on the canoe trip in 1941, and all of them are dead, but you and me. I remember the morning your mother was discovered just above the sign for Missing Lake. Did you know that? Missing Lake, Wisconsin, a 2-hour trip upriver by canoe to Minnehaha. For days it had been raining, and that morning the sky opened and the yellow sun was rising in the east, and I thought to myself, finally, the sun. And then James Willow, the head counselor and a former student of your father's from Chicago, traveling in the third and last boat, discovered your mother on the ground at the edge of the pine forest. I am so sorry. Yours truly, Roosevelt McCrary. P.S. James Willow died in 1943 as a fighter pilot in World War II. I got your address from information. I hope I'm not intruding. When the mailman arrived, Georgie was in the kitchen taking down the dishes from the cupboard to set the table for the birthday party she was giving herself that evening. Autumn sunlight spilled across the open porch, a light breeze like summer, not rare for Washington in mid-December, but the heat of the day was unusual. She waved to the mailman through the bank of windows that framed the front door, and he handed her the large stack of mail, catalogs and throwaway advertisements, bills. And this, he said, giving her the handwritten brown envelope, ripped on the edges, something yellow spilled across the address, so the destination was barely visible. It must have had a hell of a trip, the mailman said. A letter, just the fact of it was significant. An actual letter out of nowhere into this brilliant morning in Northwest Washington, D.C. She sat down on the top step of the porch and opened the envelope. News from Camp Minnehaha, her first home, the home to which she had arrived as an infant traveling the Bone River with her parents by canoe. She read the letter slowly, read it twice, and didn't realize that the breath had gone out of her until she stood leaning against the pillar on the front porch for balance. Lightheaded, she walked back in the house, passing the living room where her grandson Thomas, who had just turned 13, was lying on his side in front of the fireplace reading. A Monday, and Thomas had not gone to school again. Any interesting mail, he called. Only one, and it's for me, she replied. For your birthday, Thomas asked, without looking up from his book. More interesting than that. She would tell Thomas about the letter sometime, not today. He knew about her mother's murder at a campsite on the Bone River, and somehow it delighted him to hear her tell about it, as if the value of Thomas's own life were enhanced by his genetic proximity to such a story. She decides that what she's going to do with this letter is to take the same trip her parents had taken on the Bone River with all of her children who most certainly do not want to go. They're grown children. So she takes her grown children and her grandchildren with her on this canoe trip. And her idea is, she's an anthropologist. She believes in being on site. Her idea is that possibly she will somehow be able to prove to herself that actually her father had not killed her mother. She's a very imaginative woman. She makes a lot of things up for her own good in her own mind. And so she persuades her children that it's the only thing she would like them to do for her birthday. And that is to replicate the trip her parents took and go to the place where they camped out and where her mother was murdered. And so they do that. They're not happy to be doing this, but they do it. And Thomas decides he will write a memoir about it. He hopes to be able to sell this memoir. It's 13. And he hopes it will then go down in history as something that would be worthy of an anthropologist taking it under consideration. So this is from the memoir of Thomas Davis. We are a small family traveling the Bone River in northern Wisconsin on our way to a place we have never been called home, traveling by canoe. I am in the lead canoe paddling stern, and in the bow is Georgie, who planned this trip and gave it to us with the requirement that we come. No one, not my Uncle Nicholas or my Aunt Venus, her favorite choice for a name change, or any of the cousins, wanted to come except for me, but they didn't have the heart to tell Georgie. I wanted to come on this trip enough for all of us. On the floor of our canoe in her little red life jacket, spreading bananas on my bare leg, is Una, my Uncle Nicholas's daughter. And although she is only 4, she is the one person in the world I love completely. And it worries me to think I love her enough to lose her. If that were to happen, I would die. I think of death a lot, all the time. And I think of it as flat, without any curves or indentations, a long, perfectly straight line, which I imagine when I'm sitting in Mr. Johnson's English class, and he's telling me about roses blooming in his mouth when he thinks about poetry. And I hope he won't think about poetry until after the bell rings. We are paddling in these canoes and arriving exactly now, still daylight, at Missing Lake, Wisconsin, the place where we will spend the night before we reach our destination. Now Georgie is raising her paddle in the air, pointing to a cove shaped like a saucer with high pines surrounding a crescent of sandless beach. She motions for me to turn us toward the shore. Here we are, she called. Here is where my great-grandfather William killed his wife on the 17th of June, 1941, or confessed to killing her, as Georgie says. She believes by taking this trip, reenacting, she calls it, we will discover evidence to the contrary, that her father, in spite of his confession, did not kill his wife. Georgie is an anthropologist who spends her life researching in order to discover what has been lost so that it can be found. That is how my mother describes her work, which is why I am keeping a journal so that thousands of years from now, another anthropologist, someone like Georgie, will uncover the journal from layers and layers of earth where it has been buried and read it and know that we 7 were here on this Bone River in the town of Missing Lake on the planet Earth. Georgie likes what she calls planned coincidence. The sun must be in alignment, but you can miss them. The stars, sorry, must be in alignment, but you can miss them if you don't pay attention, she says. And taking the stars into account, she makes a plan. And their plan is, and much of the book has to do with this trip down the river, where they come to the place where her mother was murdered. And she has a sense of satisfaction at the end of the book. Whatever she's come to is what the book is about and how she's come to it. So it is a book that has essentially two main characters, and actually Thomas is my very special main character because he's looking at things from the eyes of a 13-year-old boy just at the cusp of being grown up, more grown up, a teenager, and Georgie. And Georgie is has about her, she's 70, but she has about her some of the childlike innocence that simply is a part of her personality, and is, as some people said about this book, she takes all of her children on this rather dangerous canoe trip, knowing nothing about canoeing on a river in Wisconsin. And some have said to me she's a fairly irresponsible woman. And I can understand their conclusion to that. But it's not a book that in the end fails to deliver what she was looking for satisfactory to her. And it was a fun book to write. I really loved the character of Thomas and Georgie, but all of her children as well. And it was a book that, as I find in writing novels, I remember the first novel I wrote, there was a journalist who said to me, you know, Susan, it's an okay book, but there are no happy endings. But I do feel about endings that it needs to that an ending needs to come to something that doesn't leave you in despair. And this book comes to something that doesn't leave you in despair. And I found that it was surprising. It started with looking at a picture of my grandfather, who was an immigrant, and Georgie's father was also an immigrant from Lithuania. And my grandfather was an immigrant, and he was from Denmark. And he also worked at a boys' camp. And the way, I think, for many novelists, a seed of an idea begins and then begins to grow and becomes something quite other than you might have thought, or quite unplanned in any case. And this book was that. I loved writing it. I love writing novels. It's a sort of foolish profession from a lot of points of view, but nevertheless, it's one that I feel pretty lucky to have been able to have. So that is more news tomorrow. And I think that one of the things that I've found the most exciting about writing novels is reading novels and seeing what is happening. And I think as a young child, I always loved stories. Writing stories was what I wanted to do. It seemed an impossible kind of business to actually go into, but it was also a business that suddenly seemed possible as I got older. So that's what I plan to do again. And I have written one memoir, and that's what I'm going to be doing now. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let me introduce our next speaker. Thomas Becker served as the 17th president of Chautauqua Institution, a nonprofit organization dedicated to lifelong learning. Founded in 1874, Chautauqua offers a rich blend of programming based on its 4 pillars of art, education, religion, and recreation. Tom retired from Chautauqua in December 2016 after 32 years with the organization. His current activities include board of director positions with the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., excuse me, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Lincoln University, Claremont, California, and the Sheldon Foundation, Jamestown, New York. Tom lives in Lakewood, New York with his wife, Jane, and is the father of 3 girls, a grandfather to 4 granddaughters, and arriving next March in Dublin, his first grandson. Please welcome to the screen, Thomas Becker.
Well, good evening and thank you. I appreciate that. And Susan, along with everybody else, we celebrate your foolishness. It's quite wonderful. I'm so glad you found your way to this. I am pleased and honored to join the remarkable assemblage of participants in the exercise of Right America. In the 32 years I spent in the employ of the Chautauqua Institution, I had the privilege to work with writers from around the world, from journalists to novelists, historians to poets, cartoonists to playwrights, essayists to polemicists, historians to poets, cartoonists to playwrights, and lyricists to legislators. The institution celebrates writers and the written word because it invites an exploration of the human condition. Such an exploration requires critical thinking, empathy, moral imagination, factual rigor, contextual understanding, and ethical judgment. In the mid-90s, Roger Rosenblatt gave a speech at Chautauqua titled, "Why I Write." To this day, I think of his describing standing on a bridge over a river in Rwanda, the fast-moving near flood level of the water rushing below, carrying a multitude of bodies of victims of the genocide. The bodies were flowing down the river, sometimes sinking below the surface, sometimes rising to the top, faces emerging in a broken parade of the community they once made up. Roger said that scene emphatically declared that evil is always with us, sometimes out of sight, sometimes apparent, but always there. Roger was at that site for the New York Times Magazine as an essayist and journalist whose job was to give context to facts. Roger also brought the soul of a poet for whom the crime of genocide paled as a label for the atrocity. As he brought Rwanda forward to the lives of every man in every community where evil is part of the current of life. We live in an unprecedented age of information flow. Within that flow is a buoyant array of toxic political machinations, absurdist conspiracy theories, and selfishness wrapped in the cloak of freedom. These things have always been with us, but they're at flood level in these times. The stakes are high and the consequences are profound, and writers and their work are more important than ever. While speaking at Chautauqua, E.L. Doctorow discussed the creative process of writing a novel. He stated that for him, the story unfolded as he wrote. He described it as like being in a car at night, and he could see as far into the story as the headlights in a fog. I remember thinking the discovery we experience in reading his book was in keeping with the discovery he was making in the writing. Readers and writers are actively bound together. As consumers of the written word, We need to be reminded that good writing and good reading demand attention and engagement. The poet Stanley Kunitz commented on this as follows, quote, "In the best poetry of our time, but only the best, one is aware of the moral pressure being exerted on the medium in the very act of creation. By moral, I mean the testing of existence at its highest pitch. What does it feel like to be totally oneself? An awareness of others beyond the self, a concern with the values and meaning rather than the effects, an effort to tap the spontaneity that hides in the depths rather than what forms on the surface, a conviction about the possibility of making right and wrong choices. Lacking this pressure, we are left with nothing but a vacuum occupied by technique," end quote. In an atmosphere of cynical celebration of vacuous technique and mendacious bravado, we need to lift those whose work explore the depths, mind values and meaning, who hold themselves rigorously to the right choices, and who continually work to understand themselves and others. We are a species of storytellers. Thousands of years old, an epic story of war, the Iliad, begins with the word rage, and its capture of the vanity and deceit that drove the engagement and conduct of the war in question constitute a table of contents for nearly every great conflagration since. You wonder how our moral advancement is continually undermined by our lesser nature. In part, we are not attracted to the work, the digging, required of us all as members of a democracy to listen critically, to test the moral sturdiness of arguments, to find the clean edges of reason inside the narrative, and to reject the work that fails the test of moral pressure. Indeed, this work toward understanding and making choices is the very stuff of life, and eternal as a struggle. In the beginning was the Word. I alone survived to tell the tale. I remember my first few months at a Jesuit boarding school for boys. I was 13, lonely, and still in the ragged emotional ether of my father's death 2 years earlier. I found a quiet refuge in the library where I randomly selected Kristin Lavransdatter, a sweeping tale of a woman's life in Norway in the 14th century. Life was hard and often violent. Loss was frequent and widespread. This remarkable character had a tenacious hold on hope and a bottomless wellspring of grit. We live, love, lose, and restart. While it wasn't clinical counseling, the time I spent between the covers of that amazing tale was a gift of grace. Thank God for the writers in our lives who emerge from the flow and offer the opportunity of hope and love and forgiveness. That's it, Alice.
That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. You know, what would you tell me, Susan, the thing about the more news tomorrow? More news tomorrow. Tell me how more news tomorrow works into the story you were just talking about. I love the title. How does that fit to the?
Well, it wasn't a political title, as everybody thought it was when they picked it up. So it was a very different kind of thing. But the more news tomorrow really is that they were. She is looking for the truth about her mother's death. She does not believe her father, who died in prison, killed her mother. And she eventually, at the very end, you have a sense of what happened. So that's the more news tomorrow.
I see.
And the character of Roosevelt knows a great deal. And so he is able to tell her as she gets older. So it was a fun book to write because it was written with basically the dramatic structure of a murder. And that's always helpful to a writer.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
A murder is dramatic. So that was that. But it's I was very interested in what you had to say also, because what you've done in your life has had to do with arts organizations, with the arts in America. And I remember dinner table conversations in which I argued with my father, with whom I never should have even tried to argue because he won always. But I argued with my father that the arts really made a difference, that they made a big difference in the way we lived our lives and how the pleasure we got from them. But also, I think particularly in writing books, you're writing the history of this country. And so I have found that one of the real pleasures for me of being a writer is really exactly what you were talking about, is knowing other people who are on other sides of it, but of feeling a sense of connection to this country. And I think that when we're celebrating today, Martin Luther King, I think this is the sort of thing that has always moved me in a kind of almost childlike way of believing in this country in ways that in many more cynical times than this, if there have been many more cynical times than this, it is such a loss. So
I remember that when Kurt Vonnegut was at Chautauqua, he gave two days of lectures in the amphitheater, and I had the privilege of moderating his talk the second day. And very late in the process, we were in the Q&A session, so he had stopped with his address, and we were dealing with questions from the audience, and somebody asked him the rather obvious question of, you have such a dark view of humanity, where does all that come from? And I expected him to talk about Dresden and that sort of thing, and he was quiet for the longest time. And then he said, there is an instrument that was created by man, and he sort of cups his hand like this, and he gives the name of the instrument, and he said it's like a hammer, a cudgel of some kind, and I don't recall the name he had used. And he said the purpose of this instrument was to break the legs of victims of crucifixion so that they suffer even more through asphyxiation because they can't hold themselves up. You could have heard a pin drop in the amp, right? And he looks out at the audience and he just sticks up his hand as if he's holding it. He said, we created it and we gave it a name. He put his hand down and walked off the stage. And I remember thinking, well, an author knows his ending. But that business about art and a commentary on the conditions of life and the relationship of human beings and our nature. And it is stunning how you think about some work being as old as the Iliad and how utterly descriptive it is of characters you see down the street. It's really pretty amazing, I think.
It is amazing, and somehow it's reaffirming.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's not a question of how little we've changed, how little we are the same. Mm-hmm.
Well, even that book, Christian Lies, as I said, I was a 13-year-old kid and didn't pick the book up purposefully. But here I am at an all-boys school reading, first time that I can recall reading a book that was entirely about a woman's life, And I don't know how familiar you are with that book, but it's full of moral ambiguities. It's interesting to think when it was written, and this woman struggled with parents and with people trying to force marriages and struggles with her own sexuality and all of that. It's a stunning piece of work. And to be honest, part of that was an escape for me, but the other part was the recognition that inside, it's a large book, but inside a book like that is a whole world of exploration that goes inside as well as outside, you know?
There is something remarkably wonderful about it. And I found that the reading that I've done since I was in college, because that's when I really fell in love with books. The reading that I've done, always I am surprised at what it brings. It's as though you recognize it, you know it, but there it is again. And it makes it easier to be human in dark times.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder from you, I grew up feeling that that we did not have a sort of artistic center when I was young, and I was wrong about that, but that's what it felt like in a sense. And since you've done a lot with your life in addressing that and being the only thing that in bringing the arts together and gathering people who come, particularly, I've not been to Chautauqua, but I've heard about it since I was a little girl. I'm a Midwesterner originally, and a lot of the Midwest goes to Chautauqua for their holidays, and thinking what a wonderful thing that was. That is. So, and you've spent a lot of your life doing that, just that kind of thing.
I still, after all of these years, am smitten by Chautauqua Institution. I'm stunned by the radical quality of its founding, the two people who founded it, how they had walked away from, at a time in 1874 when, especially at a religious level, things were narrowing and becoming separate and, each sort of precious in its own way. And they had this much broader outlook. And one of the founders is from Akron, actually, and was an inventor. And in fact, Thomas Edison became his son-in-law and married Mina.
Oh, really?
His second wife was Mina Miller. And so that interplay between religious urgencies and scientific discovery and invention and the pragmatic development of society was all part of the same stew, Certainly there were some tensions around the edges, but not a fundamental change. The idea that discovery and advancing our awareness of the mystery of the life we're in is an act of reverence was, I think, for their time, a rather remarkable thing to do. And then the creation of the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, the book club. When we went to the Soviet Union with a program in 1986, it was the 100th anniversary of the CLSC in Russia. That's how broad the reach was.
Wow.
It was just gigantic. Yeah. They had a real influence on social development, especially women's continuing education. So yeah, no, it's an important place. Finding its place in a modern time is an interesting struggle, but in some ways, I think it's proving itself to be just what's missing.
Yeah.
There's an admiration for the long form. There's the intermix of the arts there. Back to what we were talking about earlier, I knew people that were like the third generation in a family business and struggling, right? And part of what they're doing on the grounds is they're going to seminars that are clinically about the operation of the business and taxes and all kinds of other things. then there's the play. You know, that's about the dynamic of a business within a family and what happens to the family in the midst of all that. And I swear to you, the play had a bigger impact.
I can believe that. Yeah. No, and it's wonderful. And it's wonderful for me to think, because I didn't know about it when I was growing up. I didn't, my parents were both very artistically oriented in terms of concept. But so much of that was just not a part of our lives in Washington, D.C. then. And I think that it's much more a part of lives now. It's been picked up in different ways by different sort of groups to have the arts more at the center of things. Because I think for a long time in this country, there was a sense that there was something frivolous, didn't meet the work ethic.
The arts were on the entertainment page, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the little that I did is what you did at Chautauqua had to do with Penn Faulkner Foundation in Washington. And it started really for a political reason. It was started to not lose the arts in the eyes of the Congress, that they would, that this little organization could put pressure on the Congress. Well, it was not so. But it did make a difference to have the organization in Washington, D.C., where it was located in the Folger Shakespeare Library. It no longer is located there. It's kind of broadly located, but it still persists as an organization that is about the arts and the written arts. But it's was not, that kind of thing was not around when I was a little girl. And I think it was a good thing. And it certainly enriched my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe Roger was on our board for a while. He's been around the block a lot of times. He's helped a lot of organizations and a lot of people.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear who you said. Is that Roger you said?
Yeah,
was
Roger.
on your board?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've known Roger for 30 plus years, all entirely because of Chautauqua. I remember one time I met him in Manhattan, and we were at a diner where I had to buy, of course, and he decided he could give me a ride at the end of all of that back to my hotel, which I appreciated. And we get in the car and we're taking off, and we're going up the east. We're going down on the east side, and he suddenly realizes that he's got to get to the Flea Theater in like 3 minutes, and it's not going to happen. And I'd be way out of the way, so he literally dumps me in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I had no idea where the heck I was. So I owe him.
That's a good beginning.
Yeah. He won't get in the car with me because he knows I'll leave him someplace.
Well, he's done a lot. This is a wonderful program. It's been very fun to be a part of it, and it's a wonderful program. I'm going to go back and look at some of the past ones, which I haven't yet.
His conversation at Chautauqua with Gary Trudeau was, I think, nothing short of brilliant. And you realize that Trudeau is at the heart a journalist. He studies the facts and the background and the context of things. He's a wit, to be sure, and a great storyteller, but he's fundamentally a journalist. He looks at the world with a critical eye and great discipline.
I don't know him, but I know that Roger was a good friend of his.
Yeah, they're very good friends.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to be on Right America in a couple of weeks.
Is he?
Yes, so you're all in good company. I do have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'd like the audience to keep asking these questions because From Laura Scalzo, Susan, can you tell us about your memoir?
I would like to be writing another novel because you can make it up. But my editor would like me to write a memoir. And I have a sentence of that memoir. It's not even the first sentence, which is disappointing, but I am going to do it. That is what I'm working on, presumably now. But I think I've made it clear that I'm not working on it very hard. But I think in writing a book, there's a point in which you need to see it move into shape, and I don't have the shape of it. And part of it, I wrote one memoir. I had polio when I was a little girl, and I wrote a memoir about living at the Warm Springs Polio Foundation because that was unusual. I mean, not everybody lived there. But there were a lot of kids who had polio who lived there, and it was fun. I mean, it was actually, if you're a child and you go someplace where there are a lot of kids, it's fun. And so that was fun, and we tootled around in our wheelchairs and so forth. So that was an easy memoir to write, but to write a memoir about my life has been much harder. To think about it in those terms has been much harder. But that is what I'm writing. That is.
I do want to ask you briefly about your process. Are you a binge writer? Are you an outliner? I mean, how your actual process of writing? I mean, what are you most comfortable with?
I'm neither one of those. I write for 2 hours a day when I'm writing. I'm not always writing. I mean, for example, right now I'm not writing. I'm thinking about this book. I'm trying to see it in some sort of shape. And I've had a kind of life that has been, it's been exciting. I'm the daughter of a journalist who would like to have been a novelist, and sometimes he was novelistic in his journalism. So I think that the way I write is I do write from beginning to end. I don't write all over a book. And as soon as I have the first sentence of a book, it begins to take its own shape. It's not that it moves. I know a lot of writers say, and certainly a lot of I have taught writing. I just retired this year after 45 years of teaching writing at George Mason University and other places. But to say anything about the way a book begins and moves forward, it just is surprising the way it does. But I think you need to get that first sentence down. And to answer Laura's question, I do have the first sentence, and there I am.
I have a question for Thomas. And I know you've answered this in a way, but I wanted, Laura just put it up, and it was after you told the Vonnegut story. So Thomas, you've seen so many writers speak. Is there one that was particularly powerful? And you did mention Vonnegut, but of course we'd like to hear more.
Well, so many.
I'm sure.
Truly, Roger's talk about why I write has stayed with me, for decades now. We had a theologian from McGill, John David Hall. Okay? John David Hall. And he came in, and this was an abstract week. We were talking about self, and he used 4 stanzas of a Bonhoeffer poem that Bonhoeffer wrote when he was in jail, that basically takes on the exploration of, can I be known? And who knows me? Does my jailer know me? He sees me. And it comes through to the end, and do I know me? And in all of that, his point is that in each of the structures he uses, it's an incomplete picture, right? And he finishes with the phrase, whatever I am thine, so ultimately it's a statement of faith. his explication of all of that was literary and brilliant, but he had a fever of 104, which he told me about as we were walking onto the platform. And I thought, oh my goodness. So, but he was absolutely magnificent. And I bet he spoke for, I don't know, 50 minutes or so. And I found it truly brilliant. His take of all of that and how he managed to make it like an internal dialogue that everybody in that amphitheater could have engaged in. And he invited them into that. It was really quite.
It's impressive.
Brilliant. Yeah, it was really, really impressive. And Kunitz he was amazing. You know, he comes in, lays out layers, and everybody weeps. You know, he's wonderful. Jim Lehrer was an enthusiastic, lovely man whose description of
Really?
his passions and his writing beyond journalism. And Kate, his wife, who wrote tons of very good books, the couples that, you know, Alan Alda and Eileen are like that as well. You know, they can finish each other's sentences, but they write very different kinds of books. It's yeah. No, I'm trying to think. Montalban, an African, came in and talked about his family and the women in his tribe. That was one of the most surprising and touching I've heard.
Well, the variety that you've experienced is really something that it never really occurred to me until you started speaking about it. I mean, the breadth of talent that came through your doors is, you don't think about it until you actually hear about it or you've experienced it yourself, because clearly I've not been there to hear that.
Yeah, we had an evening where Billy Collins and Paul Simon sat and talked about poetry and music.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was one of those occasions that you just, yeah, it is very intimate, very lovely. And it's interesting how Simon never worked from the words to the music. It was always from the music to the words. Many songwriters do that. But the thing I remember from that evening, beyond the fact that the two of them had such a good time together and the place was packed, and so at the end of their conversation, then we did a Q&A, and then Billy gets up to read, and he gets this standing ovation at the end of his readings, and people are pounding on the benches, and it just erupts in all of this noise. And I thought, well, okay, so they're doing that for the poet. I like this place. That's before Paul Simon got up and sang a little bit. So that was a very reaffirming moment about Chautauqua. And also, you had talked about Dan Brown earlier. Dan Brown did come. His dad taught math at a very prestigious high school. Yeah, and his mom played the organ in the church.
Well, the reason I have to, this was mentioned in the green room. I mentioned liking Dan Brown because I could go to Italy every time I read one of his books. I mean, it was always this, oh, I remember the Pantheon. Okay, I've been there. So, you know, there's all kinds of reasons for loving a book or a story. But clearly, you each have had such different experiences, but there's always that commonality of how it touches people. And that's very meaningful. And you both talked about that tonight. As a bookseller, I would be irresponsible if I didn't ask you what you were reading right now. I have to ask that question. And nothing, you know, just because. Susan? Go ahead, Tom.
Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, all right. So
I'm-
I just finished Cloud Cuckoo Land and Woke Racism, McWhorter's. Andrew Dorr.
Anthony Doerr wrote
Yeah.
Cloud Cuckoo Land. He is the author of All the Light We Cannot See. This is his
Right.
new book.
Right.
It,
And I'm just starting Galgut's The Promise.
oh yeah.
Yeah. And Hampton Sides has a set of essays, some of the journalists, in a book called Americana. And it's great fun.
Are you one of those
It's,
people that reads more than one book at a time?
Yes, two
Ah,
usually.
okay.
Yeah. And I like them if they're different kinds of writing. Yeah. So that's what I'm reading now.
Susan, what are you reading?
I am reading memoirs because that's what I'm going to be writing. And my younger daughter just finished Cloud Cuckoo Land. She loved it, and I will certainly read that. It's my copy that she took. And I'm also reading memoirs, just looking through various memoirs and how people have done them for my own purposes. And I have decided for this sort of year, I'm going to be reading more history. I love history. I love history from the standpoint of being a novelist, and not that I'm so authentic about the history that I've included, but I'm always interested in the effects that a particular time has on one's own life. And but specifically, I'm looking at memoirs.
Well, thank you. I always want to know what people are.
I always read Hilma Wolitzer, and her new book.
It's great.
Is wonderful.
And Hilma's here tonight.
Yes, I know she is.
Hi, Hilma.
Hilma and I came out with our first novels at the same time. And so I've always had a special interest in her work. Both of our first novels were about widows. There was someone who was an actual widow who wrote a book called Widows. And when Hilma and I first met, we were both with our husbands, and we both thought and actually said to one another how interesting it was that we'd met someone so soon after the loss of our husband, but our husbands had not died. Our husbands were sitting next to us. And so it was this comment that was always interesting for new novelists of, are you telling the truth because you've written a novel? Does that mean it was the truth, what really happened? And for us, it had not really happened. Now it has happened to us both.
Oh my. Well, folks, this has been a wonderful evening, and I want to thank you both. It's just so special what Roger has brought together, and I am thrilled that both of you joined us tonight, and I am going to minimize you and take you off screen. And I'm going to close out by saying I'd like to thank Susan and Thomas for participating in Write America this evening, and to every one of you who tuned in tonight. And thank you particularly to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to every single Monday night. We hope to see you all next Monday as we welcome Gary Trudeau and Jules Pfeiffer to Write America for a very special episode as they discuss the art of cartooning. Please remember Birds Books has the author's books, many of them signed. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stay safe and be well.